Hi, John. How are you today?
Good, Elliot. Welcome back. The hope is that 2026 is not as chaotic as 2025, but we haven't actually started off that way. And I guess the first thing I would mention is everybody is aware that last week the US military had a very successful event in Venezuela. The only thing I'll mention regarding that is those activities will impact sanctions to some degree, whether they be against additional individuals or entities that do business in that area. We'll wait and see. But the relevance, I think, to our world is the explanation right now is multifaceted, to say the least, right? And what's interesting to me, and we mentioned this last year, the administration pardoned the drug trafficking ex president of Honduras. I'll just leave that out there. Let folks make other views regarding what's going on. But this is going to continue to be something that will challenge national security, however you feel about it. So obviously that we know that went on, and we're watching to see the potential impact on the AML world, because one of the things that Maduro is being charged with is money laundering. So we'll see how that plays out.
We will, and I think it'll take a while to see where this all goes. So, where, besides that, would you like to start?
As always, there's both international news that we cover as well as domestic. Just a couple of quick domestic issues. Over the holidays, FinCEN issued a final rule to extend the effective date of the AML and SAR reporting requirements for registered investment advisors and those that are exempt from reporting. Made sure that people know that it was extended from January 1st of 2026, which would have been already occurred, to January 1st of 2028. That was announced by FinCEN over the holidays. In addition, late in December, they also announced what they're calling a data-driven border operation to address potential money laundering. Basically, they're targeting more than 100 MSBs operating along the southwest border. And according to the note from FinCEN, these MSBs, I'm quoting here, which provide financial services outside of a formal bank, are being examined for potential non-compliance with regulations designed to detect money laundering. FinCEN continues, their operations resulted in the issuance of 6 notices of investigation, dozen of exam referrals to the IRS, and over 50 compliance outreach letters. And I know that you saw another item from FinCEN besides the two that I mentioned.
I did. They published guidance for the new residential real estate reporting rule, which will be effective March 1st of this year. The materials are designed to help the industry get ready. There's really two significant pieces of the guidance. The first is a bunch of technical things. So for those parts of the industry who haven't had to file with FinCEN in the past, it's all of the technical details and testing details and things like that to get set up for direct electronic filing. That's one piece. The other piece is what you think of generally as guidance, who has to file reports, what are the main concepts of the rule, reference guide for exceptions that apply to trusts, if you recall, and then common FAQs. So there is clarity that the reports can be submitted by third-party service providers. Again, if you're familiar with the rule, I don't think there's any surprises in here, but I think many of the people who will be responsible for reporting under the rule going forward may be new to this, particularly smaller organizations, and we'll have to see. I'm sure the industry will end up figuring out who's going to provide some of these services, where in the chain of the transaction it's going to happen. It may be title companies in a lot of places, could be mortgage companies, could be banks, depending on the structure of everything. But that's worth seeing. That's available on the FinCEN website.
One other thing, the OCC over the holidays, and the OCC, let's face it, is going to be the lead besides FinCEN regarding things related to AML and crypto and other things. But they reissued, I would suggest, a warning to financial institutions that they had originally put out in September. and reminded institutions that, quote, banks should not use voluntary suspicious activity reports as a pretext to improperly disclose customers' financial information or evade the right to Financial Privacy Act. A premise that, frankly, I don't accept. It'll be interesting to see how banks document their SAR filings going forward based on this document that Gould has reissued, put it out first in September, reissued it in late December. So I thought that was worth mentioning. And then one other thing that we didn't talk about, I subscribe to a publication called Punchbowl News, which focuses very specifically on legislation and regulation in the US. A lot of it is produced for people that are lobbyists and that sort of thing. But I saw something this morning that I thought I would mention, and that is that they are reporting that Senator Tim Scott, who is the chairman of the Senate Banking Committee, wants to move quickly being, in the next few weeks, on crypto-related legislation. I think we've covered this before. We know that the financial industry is concerned about some of what's in I believe it's in the Genius Act, dealing with potentially impacting deposits at financial institutions, which is not our world. But when I read this, it said two things: that Scott wants to move on this. Things have been relatively bipartisan, but at least the quotes from sources that they've talked to suggest that this is not going to be an easy lift. So again, those that are paying attention to crypto legislation should watch to see what the Senate plans to do in the next several weeks.
I think if we look to the UK and the EU, we see that putting in a broad and what we think will be an effective regime in place to deal with crypto assets and cryptocurrencies is a long journey. I think it's going to be very difficult to do anything. Forget the bipartisan, just the mechanics.
Right.
What are you going to do? And then the level of lobbying in the United States seems to me to be always bigger, deeper, and louder than in other parts of the world. And I may be 100% wrong on that, but I expect there'll be a line of people out the door of every committee meeting yelling and screaming about something. So be fun to watch.
I guess. We'll see. Why don't we go ahead and cover some international issues?
Sure. So effective January 1st, there are some new rules related to taxes on crypto platforms and other things that are going into effect in the EU and the UK. A little bit of quick background. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, a number of years ago, put together something called the Crypto Asset Reporting Framework, CARF. And I can't remember off the top of my head, but I think it's 75 countries have committed to implementing CARF. And what does CARF do? CARF requires exchanges and platforms to gather users' identification information, account details, and transaction records, and they have to submit this data to domestic tax authorities. And the system replaces reliance on a case-by-case cooperation with investigators. The information gathering part of the requirement kicks in now, and in September 30th of 2027, the information sharing components will kick in. I was curious to see whether the US was involved in this. We did sign on and make a commitment to the OECD regime that creates CARF, but to this point, we have not taken all the steps to put it in place, including we would have to pass federal legislation that would make this happen. So we'll see. I mean, I haven't seen anything specifically about CARF lately coming out of Congress, but we'll have to see what happens. It is a very important change, and I think having the EU and the UK moving along at this pace is a good sign. The other thing that we saw is that the Netherlands, beginning again January 1st, now has a ban on cash transactions over 3,000 euros. And this applies to commercial transactions involving goods between professional buyers and sellers. The ban doesn't yet apply to some service providers, but it does apply to pawn shop operators, art dealers, card dealerships, jewelers, electronics stores, furniture stores, shopkeepers, and all traders in goods, which is kind of interesting. What it does away with is the requirement to report transactions above 3,000 because they're prohibited. On the one hand, it's reducing the reporting burden, and on the other hand, it's trying to make transactions that have a higher possibility of being involved with illicit sources and illicit purposes from happening. So we'll see whether, as time goes by, whether they're successful, and if they are, whether this gets picked up in other places in the EU and around the world.
Yeah, definitely, potentially both pretty interesting. It'll be interesting also to see how these things play out from a practical standpoint and whether it has any impact on what other jurisdictions are doing.
Correct.
So, a couple of other things. The Organized Crime and Corruption Project posted last week that they have done their most recent investigation is into the sale of U.S. planes that are used in the global illicit drug trade. Their reporting, according to them, shines a spotlight on how outdated federal rules and lax oversight facilitate high-level drug trafficking across Latin America and allow drug traffickers to actually acquire U.S. jets. They also spoke to NPR about that, which you can go online and look at, Morning Edition. But the investigative reporter, his name is Johnny Rate, W-R-A-T-E, from the OCCRP.
It was interesting. The sequence of how this appears to be happening is that U.S. registered aircraft can be bought and sold without any vetting of the buyer. And so many of them are being sold to shell companies that are established in the U.S. so that they can retain their U.S. registration and then used by foreign owners, both for privacy purposes, but also for nefarious purposes. I think the report described this area of airplane sales as the Wild West.
Yeah, and continuing with that theme of the Wild West, just a couple things. Another investigative reporter posted also late last week a story in a somewhat innocuous publication, which frankly I wasn't familiar with, but it's how FIFA, the international soccer organization, is actively punishing football teams who have not made outstanding payments to Russian clubs for player transfers, arguing that they couldn't pay that due to sanctions. So FIFA has ruled in almost every single case you have to pay regardless of sanctions issues, which I thought was fascinating. I had not seen that anywhere else. I did also notice, though, also late last year in The Athletic, they wrote a story that Russia may actually be able to return to international soccer football after a 4-year absence from FIFA sanctions competition. And this is an opening which is really strange given that the war in Ukraine is still on. But their council announced the creation of what they're calling an under 15 festival style tournament. So it's going to be a boys and girls tournament for those under 15, and they are going to be allowed to participate regardless of where they sit. So that could mean a readmittance of Russia later. So we'll see how that goes.
Apparently, soccer clubs are more afraid of FIFA than they are of OFAC.
Yes.
Or the UK or the EU or the UN.
But the world is definitely upside down, to say the least. Yep. So that's all I had on my end. What else do you have?
There was a report by the Financial Times related to the fact that money laundering and sanction fines in the U.S. fell 61%. It talked about some of the reason possibly being deregulation. There's also the question of how the numbers compare. 2024 was very high because of the very large fine to TD, which was a 2024 event. A number of smart folks, including our friend Dan Stepano, were quoted in the article, focusing on a variety of things, policy changes, the FCPA changes off again and on again, things like that. But there seemed to be a consensus in the article that The current administration has put out the word across the various enforcement agencies to be less aggressive in the sizes of fines. I think these are things you have to look at, maybe not just year by year, but on a more longitudinal basis. But we'll see where this goes. So, John, I know you've been working hard on our January webinar. You want to tell us what that's about?
Well, I think everybody that listens to this knows that January is Anti-Human Trafficking Month. And like many other organizations, we attempt to give as much practical and new information as possible. So on January 22nd at 1 o'clock Eastern, we are going to do that again, as we've done in previous Januaries. So we're efforting several experts. We have one internal and a couple of external ones. I'm just trying to finalize everything. And that will be from 1 to 2 Eastern time. Obviously, it'd be great if you can join us live, but if not, the recordings will be available shortly thereafter. One more thing I wanted to mention. We are recording this on January 7th. Yesterday was January 6th, and those in the United States that are well aware that 5 years ago, domestic terrorists attempted to take over the Capitol. Regardless of what one may read, and regardless of your party affiliation, facts are facts. The notion that it was anything other than something that was enabled by policymakers, unfortunately, is just not only inaccurate, it's blatantly false. I wanted to add that right before the holidays, the House Republicans released Jack Smith, the special counsel's testimony that he gave behind closed doors back in December. And according to the transcript, just a couple things I wanted to reference here. In his opening statement, Jack Smith said the following, quote, "Our investigation developed proof beyond a reasonable doubt that President Trump engaged in a criminal scheme to overturn the results of the 2020 election and to prevent the lawful transfer of power," unquote. He also talks about the document issues, but going back to January 6th, he says another couple of things. Our evidence is that he, meaning the president, in the weeks leading up to the January 6th, created a level of distrust. He used that level of distrust to get people to believe fraud claims that weren't true. He made false statements to state legislatures, to his supporters, in all sorts of contexts, and was aware in the days leading up to January 6th that his supporters were angry when he invited them and then he directed them to the Capitol, unquote. A very famous member of the Senate, ambassador to the UN, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, once said, and it's something we try to live by every day, "You're entitled to your own opinion. You're not entitled to your own facts." We won't forget January 6th of 2021, and neither should you. And I'll just leave it at that.
Thanks, John. I will talk to you next week. You have a good rest of the week.
Take care.
You too. Bye-bye.